Every parent dreams of hearing their child's laughter fill their home again. Malcolm Price lost that chance forever when grief and pride drove his daughter away. At 58, this billionaire has everything money can buy, but his heart remains empty. During a gala at his estate, Malcolm's arrogance takes over when he spots a young waitress near his piano. With cruel amusement, he challenges her to play, mocking someone in uniform, understanding music. What happens next will silence the room and shake Malcolm to his core. The teenager quietly accepts and plays a beautiful classical piece, the melody his daughter used to fill their home. Can one moment of beauty break through decades of pride and teach a father what really matters? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Price estate, illuminating dust motes that danced in the silence. Malcolm Price stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, watching groundskeepers tend to the immaculate gardens that stretched toward the Virginia hills. At 58, he possessed the kind of wealth that most people could barely comprehend, a fortune built from nothing through decades of ruthless business decisions and an unwavering focus on success. His reflection in the window showed a man who had aged well, despite the recent trials. Silver threads wove through his dark hair, and lines of experience mapped his face. The custom-tailored suit hung perfectly on his still athletic frame, a testament to personal trainers and careful attention to appearance. Yet something hollow lurked behind his dark eyes, something that no amount of money could fill. The study itself told the story of a man who had conquered the world of commerce. Awards and plaques lined the walls, photographs of handshakes with presidents and prime ministers, newspaper clippings documenting his rise from a poor kid in Detroit to one of America's wealthiest self-made billionaires. Technology patents, real estate ventures, strategic acquisitions, every decision had been calculated, every risk measured and conquered. But tucked away in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, hidden beneath insurance documents and legal papers, lay a photograph he couldn't bear to look at anymore. Emma, his daughter, at her high school graduation, her smile radiant as she held her diploma. Her dark eyes sparkled with dreams and possibilities, the same eyes that had grown cold and distant in their final years together. The photo remained face down, buried like the grief he refused to acknowledge. Malcolm turned away from the window as his assistant, Maria Gonzalez, knocked and entered. She had worked for him for 15 years, one of the few people who dared to speak honestly to him. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her expression carried the weariness of someone who had witnessed too many of her boss's moods. "The caterers are here, Mr. Price," she said, consulting her tablet. "And the florists are setting up in the ballroom. Everything's on schedule for tonight's gala." Malcolm nodded absently. The annual fundraising gala for the Malcolm Price Foundation had become one of Virginia's premier social events. Politicians, business leaders, and celebrities would gather in his ballroom to write checks for underprivileged youth, a cause that felt increasingly ironic given his recent failures as a father. "How many confirmed?" he asked, settling behind his desk. 312. "The governor's coming, along with that new tech billionaire from Seattle. We're expecting to raise over $2 million for the foundation." "Good." Malcolm's voice carried no emotion. Numbers on a spreadsheet, tax deductions, positive publicity, it had all become mechanical, a performance he'd perfected over years of public appearances. Maria hesitated at the doorway. "Sir, I should mention that we had to bring in some additional serving staff from the restaurant downtown. Our usual team was short-handed." "Fine. Just make sure they know how to behave around important people." The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. Maria had learned not to challenge her employer's increasingly bitter outlook, especially when it came to what he called the help. The divorce from his wife Sandra 6 months ago had stripped away what little warmth remained in Malcolm Price, leaving behind a man who measured everyone's worth by their net worth. As Maria left, Malcolm found himself alone with memories he'd spent months trying to suppress. The divorce had been nasty, public and expensive. Sandra had taken half of everything, but more devastating was what she'd said in her final court statement. Malcolm Price is a man who built an empire but lost his soul. He destroyed every relationship that mattered, starting with his own daughter. The words stung because they carried truth. Emma had died in a car accident just 2 weeks before the divorce was finalized. She was 26, talented, brilliant, and they hadn't spoken in 8 months. Their last conversation had been a screaming match about her impractical dreams of becoming a professional musician. He'd called her naive, told her to get a real job, accused her of wasting the expensive education he'd provided. She'd looked at him with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "You don't understand anything about what matters, Dad," she'd said quietly. "Money isn't everything. Even if it's all you see." Those were the last words his daughter ever spoke to him. Malcolm shook his head, pushing the memories aside. Today was about the gala, about maintaining the facade that he was a philanthropist who cared about helping young people achieve their dreams. The irony wasn't lost on him. He raised millions for youth programs while having failed spectacularly with his own child. Downstairs, the Price estate hummed with activity. The ballroom, capable of holding 400 people, was being transformed into an elegant venue. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light, and workers arranged round tables with precision. In the corner, his pride and joy, a 1925 Steinway Model D concert grand piano, sat silent and untouched. It had cost him more than most people's homes. A beautiful instrument that once filled the house with music. Emma used to play that piano. As a child, she'd sit on the bench, her legs dangling, picking out simple melodies. As she grew older and more skilled, the music became complex, haunting, beautiful. Chopin nocturnes, Bach inventions, Debussy's impressionistic pieces. She'd played them all with a passion that Malcolm had never understood. He'd seen it as a hobby, something she'd outgrow when she got serious about life. Now, the piano bench sat empty, a monument to silence and regret. The catering staff worked efficiently around the ballroom, setting up serving stations and checking sound equipment. Among them was a slight figure that might have gone unnoticed if not for her careful attention to every detail. Leela Chen was 17, though she looked younger, with her delicate features and shy demeanor. She moved quietly between tables, adjusting silverware and ensuring water glasses sparkled without a single smudge. Unlike the other servers, all adults with experience at high-end events, Lila was new to this world of wealth and privilege. She'd gotten the job through her cousin, who worked at the downtown restaurant that supplied additional staff for the gala. Every dollar she earned went toward helping her grandmother pay medical bills and keeping their small apartment. Leela had grown up in a different world from the one she now served. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 3, bringing dreams of opportunity and education for their daughter. They'd worked multiple jobs, her father in construction, her mother cleaning offices at night. They'd saved every penny to buy a small electronic keyboard for Lila when she showed musical aptitude at age 7. That keyboard, with its plastic keys and tinny sound, had been Lila's window into a world of beauty that transcended their modest circumstances. She taught herself to read music from library books, practice scales during the few quiet hours when her grandmother wasn't watching television too loudly. When her parents died in a factory fire 3 years ago, music became her refuge from grief and responsibility. Now she supported herself and her aging grandmother through part-time jobs while finishing high school. The restaurant work paid better than her usual gig at a fast food place, but it also thrust her into environments where she felt the weight of class differences with every interaction. As Lila polished wine glasses, she couldn't help but notice the magnificent piano in the corner of the ballroom. Its ebony surface reflected the chandelier light like still water, and she could imagine the rich, complex tones that would pour from its strings. She'd only ever played on cheap keyboards and the old upright piano in her high school's music room, but she recognized quality when she saw it. Don't even think about touching it, warned James, the head caterer, noticing her gaze. That thing costs more than most people make in a year. Mr. Price is very particular about his possessions. Lila nodded, understanding the unspoken message. People like her were meant to serve, not to aspire. She'd learned that lesson many times in her 17 years, but somehow the music in her heart never got the memo. When she looked at that piano, she didn't see an expensive object she couldn't afford. She saw possibilities, melodies waiting to be born, emotions yearning for expression. Malcolm appeared in the ballroom around 4 o'clock, surveying the preparations with the critical eye of a man accustomed to perfection. He'd changed into his tuxedo, and the formal wear lent him an air of authority that made the staff unconsciously straighten their postures. This was his domain, his carefully constructed world, where everything operated according to his specifications. He walked through the room, noting every detail, occasionally making sharp comments about adjustments needed. The flowers weren't quite right, too bright, too cheerful for his current mood. The lighting needed to be dimmed slightly for the proper ambience. The sound system required testing to ensure his speech would carry clearly to every corner of the room, and make sure the staff understands they're to be invisible, he told Maria. I don't want servers standing around chatting or making noise while my guests are eating. This isn't a country club dinner, it's a serious fundraising event. Maria nodded, though she'd heard this speech before every major event for years. Malcolm's standards had always been high, but lately they'd become almost impossible to meet. Nothing satisfied him. No detail was perfect enough, no service quite invisible enough. As he spoke, Malcolm's eyes swept across the serving staff, cataloguing them like inventory. Most were familiar faces from previous events. Professionals who knew how to blend into the background while efficiently managing the needs of wealthy guests. But one face caught his attention. The young Asian girl polishing glasses near his piano seemed different from the others. Younger, certainly, but there was something else. While the other servers moved with the practiced efficiency of people doing a job, she moved with a gentleness that suggested genuine care for what she was doing. Even polishing water glasses, she worked as if the task mattered. Malcolm found himself irritated by her presence near his piano. Young people today had no respect for valuable things, no understanding of what it took to acquire objects of beauty and significance. The piano wasn't just furniture. It was a piece of art, a masterwork of craftsmanship that deserved reverence. "Who's the kid?" he asked Maria quietly, nodding toward Lila, one of the extras from the restaurant. "Lila something. Chinese, I think. Why?" "Just make sure she knows to stay away from anything valuable. I don't need some teenager breaking something that can't be replaced." The dismissiveness in his voice was casual, automatic. He'd spent years reducing people to simple categories, useful or useless, profitable or costly, worth his time or beneath his notice. The young waitress clearly fell into the latter categories, just another face in the blur of service people who made his life comfortable. But as Malcolm walked away to continue his inspection, Leela had overheard enough of the conversation to understand his opinion of her. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment and something deeper, a familiar ache of being judged and found wanting by someone who knew nothing about her. Except her appearance and job, she returned to her work with quiet dignity, the same dignity she'd learned from watching her parents navigate a world that often saw them as less than fully human. They taught her that a person's worth wasn't determined by others' opinions, and that respect was something you gave yourself regardless of whether others offered it. Still, as the afternoon wore on, and the ballroom filled with the final preparations for the evening's gala, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to walk into a world where her very presence would be seen as an intrusion. She thought of her grandmother, waiting at home for the money this job would provide, and steeled herself for whatever the evening might bring. The stage was set for a collision between two worlds, two sets of values, two people who had no idea how profoundly they were about to change each other's lives. The Price estate transformed into a glittering showcase of wealth and influence as evening settled over Virginia. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, Bentleys, Maseratis, and Teslas, reflecting the soft glow of strategically placed lighting. Women in designer gowns stepped carefully across polished marble floors, their jewelry catching the chandelier light, while men in perfectly tailored tuxedos discussed stock portfolios and political campaigns. With the casual confidence of those accustomed to shaping the world, Malcolm moved through his guests with practiced charm, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries about market conditions and vacation homes in the Hamptons. To observers, he appeared to be the consummate host, gracious, attentive, successful. But beneath the polished exterior, a familiar emptiness gnawed at him. These people weren't friends. They were connections, networking opportunities, sources of donations and business partnerships. The relationships were as artificial as the smiles everyone wore. "Malcolm, wonderful event as always," gushed Senator Patricia Whitmore, air-kissing his cheeks. "You've outdone yourself with the decorations." "Thank you, Patricia. I trust we can count on your continued support for the Foundation's initiatives." "Of course, darling. Education for underprivileged youth, so important." Her attention was already drifting toward the appetizer table. The conversation a perfunctory ritual they both performed, without genuine engagement, the irony of hosting a fundraiser for underprivileged youth while treating working-class people as invisible. Servants never occurred to Malcolm. He'd compartmentalized his life so completely that philanthropy existed in a separate space from his daily interactions with those who actually needed help. As the evening progressed, the serving staff moved like ghosts through the crowd, refilling wine glasses and offering hors d'oeuvres with silent efficiency. Lila carried her tray of champagne flutes carefully, hyper-aware of every step on the marble floors. The shoes the restaurant had provided were slightly too large, and she concentrated on not stumbling in front of people who probably spent more on a single dinner than her family made in a month. She'd never been in a house like this before. The ballroom alone was larger than her entire apartment, and everywhere she looked, she saw objects that spoke of wealth beyond imagination. Crystal chandeliers that cast rainbows on the walls, oil paintings in gilded frames, fresh flowers arranged by professionals who understood that beauty could be purchased and arranged according to mathematical principles. But dominating the space, drawing her attention repeatedly, despite her efforts to remain focused on her work, was the Steinway grand piano. It sat in the corner like a sleeping giant, its lid closed, its silence somehow more powerful than any music. Lila had read about instruments like this in music magazines at the library, concert grand pianos that cost more than most houses. Instruments capable of producing sounds that cheaper keyboards could only approximate. Champagne. She offered to a cluster of women discussing their children's acceptances to prestigious universities. They barely glanced at her as they selected glasses, continuing their conversation about boarding schools and trust funds without acknowledging her presence. Lila had grown accustomed to being invisible to wealthy people, but tonight the contrast felt especially sharp. These women casually discussed spending amounts on their children's education that could have transformed her entire life. Yet they looked through her as if she were furniture. She was refilling glasses near the piano when Malcolm approached the small podium that had been set up for his speech. The conversations gradually died down as guests gathered to hear from their host, wine glasses in hand. Faces arranged in expressions of polite attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Malcolm began, his voice carrying easily through the room's excellent acoustics. "Thank you for joining me tonight in support of the Malcolm Price Foundation. As you know, our mission is to provide educational opportunities for young people who might otherwise never reach their potential." Applause rippled through the crowd, the kind of measured approval that accompanied charity events among the wealthy. Malcolm continued, his practiced speech hitting all the expected notes about responsibility, opportunity, and giving back to society. Too many talented young people are held back by circumstances beyond their control, he said. his voice carrying what sounded like genuine conviction. They have dreams, ambitions, the desire to achieve something meaningful with their lives, but they lack the resources and connections that many of us take for granted. Lila paused in her serving, struck by the disconnect between Malcolm's words and his earlier dismissal of her as someone to be kept away from valuable objects. He spoke eloquently about helping disadvantaged youth while treating her as a potential threat to his possessions. Education opens doors, Malcolm continued, warming to his theme. It transforms lives, breaks cycles of poverty, creates opportunities for advancement. But education isn't just about academics. It's about exposure to culture, to art, to the finer things that elevate the human spirit. As if summoned by his own words, Malcolm's gaze fell on the piano, and his expression shifted subtly. The instrument that had once filled his home with his daughter's music now stood silent, a monument to lost possibilities. Emma had tried to tell him that music was education too, that art and culture weren't luxuries, but necessities for the soul. He dismissed her arguments as impractical romantic nonsense. Music, in particular, he heard himself saying, has the power to transform lives, to speak directly to the human heart in ways that words cannot. The words felt hollow in his mouth, borrowed from Emma's passionate speeches about why her musical studies mattered. The speech concluded to enthusiastic applause, and guests returned to their conversations and drinks. Malcolm accepted congratulations on his eloquent words, but his attention kept drifting to the piano and the young waitress who lingered near it. Lila was trying to balance her tray of empty glasses when she noticed Malcolm approaching. Something in his expression made her nervous, a calculated look that suggested he was planning something she wouldn't like. "You seem fascinated by my piano," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby guests. Several conversations paused as people turned to observe this unusual interaction between the host and a server. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just what? Admiring something you'll never be able to afford." The cruelty in his voice was casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Let me guess, you probably think you can play, don't you?" Lila's face burned with embarrassment as she realized more people were listening. She could feel their eyes on her. These wealthy strangers who were about to witness her humiliation at the hands of their host. I do play a little, sir," she managed quietly, her dignity preventing her from lying even as she sensed the trap closing around her. Malcolm smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "How charming. And where did you learn?" "Juilliard, Berkeley." The sarcasm dripped from his words, drawing nervous chuckles from his audience. "I taught myself." "Mostly?" Lila replied, her voice barely audible. "Ah, self-taught. How quaint." Malcolm's performance was hitting its stride now. "Tell me, do you think someone in a uniform, someone whose job it is to serve drinks, could possibly understand an instrument like this? This piano is worth more than your family probably makes in 5 years." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casualness. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. This was Malcolm's house, his event, his right to entertain himself however he chose. "Why don't you prove me wrong?" Malcolm continued, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. "If you're so musical, if you think you understand art and culture, then play something. Show us what a self-taught waitress can do with a real instrument." The challenge hung in the air like a poison cloud. Lila stood frozen, her tray trembling slightly in her hands as 300 of Virginia's most powerful people waited to see how this cruel theater would play out. She could walk away. She should walk away, accept the humiliation, finish her shift, take her pay, and never return to this world where people like Malcolm Price used their wealth as weapons to wound those who couldn't fight back. Instead, something in her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Music is the one thing they cannot take from you, little one. It belongs to your heart." Lila set down her tray with steady hands and looked directly at Malcolm. "All right," she said quietly, her voice carrying further than she expected in the hushed room. "I'll play something." The gasps were audible as she walked to the piano bench. Malcolm's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to something closer to concern. He'd expected her to flee in embarrassment, not accept his challenge. But it was too late now to retreat without losing face in front of his guests. Lila lifted the piano's lid, revealing the pristine ivory and ebony keys that hadn't been touched in months. The Steinway was perfectly tuned, maintained by professionals who understood its value even if its owner no longer appreciated its purpose. She sat on the bench, adjusting her position slightly, and placed her hands over the keys without touching them. In this moment, the ballroom fell completely silent, as if 300 people were holding their breath simultaneously. Then Lila began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated through the ballroom like whispered secrets, each note perfectly placed, the melody emerging from the silence with heartbreaking beauty. Her fingers moved across the keys with a confidence that belied her humble appearance, drawing sounds from the Steinway that it had been waiting months to release. Malcolm's face went pale as the familiar melody filled the room. This was Emma's piece, the composition she'd played over and over during her teenage years, the music that had once filled his house with warmth and beauty. But hearing it now, played by this young woman he'd tried to humiliate, the music seemed to carry new meaning, new emotional weight. The ballroom remained frozen as Lila's performance continued, each phrase of the Nocturne revealing layers of musical understanding that contradicted everything Malcolm had assumed about her. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur, this was artistry, genuine musical communication that spoke directly to the heart. And Malcolm Price, for the first time in months, felt his carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crack. The Nocturne unfolded through the ballroom like a living thing, each phrase building upon the last with an emotional depth that seemed impossible from someone so young. Lila's hands moved across the keys with an intimacy that spoke of countless hours of practice, of a relationship with music that transcended the mere mechanics of performance. The Steinway responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly these hands to awaken it from its months of silence. Malcolm stood transfixed. His breath caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. The melody wrapped around him like a familiar embrace, carrying him back to evenings when Emma would sit at this same piano, her dark hair falling across her face as she lost herself in Chopin's delicate melodies. He could see her as clearly as if she were sitting there now, 16 years old, her fingers finding the same passages, the same subtle shadings that had always made this piece her favorite. The memory hit him with devastating clarity. Emma at the piano on a Sunday evening, the house quiet except for her music. Malcolm standing in the doorway of his study with business papers in his hand. He'd been irritated by the interruption to his work, the way the music pulled his attention from more important matters. "Can you play something else?" he'd asked, his voice sharp with impatience. "I have calls to make." Emma had stopped mid-phrase, her hands falling to her lap. "This is my favorite piece. Dad, I've been working on it for months. It's very nice, sweetheart, but I really need quiet for these negotiations." He'd already turned back toward his study, missing the hurt that flashed across his daughter's face, the way her shoulders sagged with disappointment. Now, hearing the same music played with the same passion, Malcolm felt the weight of that moment, and 1,000 others like it. How many times had he dismissed Emma's music as background noise to his more important concerns? How many times had he failed to truly listen, to understand that she was trying to share something precious with him? Lila's interpretation of the Nocturne was different from Emma's, more mature in some ways, touched with a melancholy that came from genuine hardship rather than adolescent sentiment. But the core emotion was identical. A young person using music to express feelings too complex for words, to create beauty in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. The assembled guests watched in stunned silence as the waitress, who had been invisible to them moments before, revealed herself as an artist of remarkable ability. Conversations that had seemed so important minutes earlier now felt trivial in the face of this unexpected beauty. Women who had been discussing charity balls and vacation homes found themselves wiping tears from their eyes. Men who measured success only in financial terms struggled to quantify what they were hearing. Senator Whitmore, who had dismissed Lila's presence entirely, now stared at the young woman with something approaching awe. "My God," she whispered to her husband, "where did she learn to play like that?" Tech billionaire James Morrison, who had been prepared to write a perfunctory check and leave early, found himself leaning forward in his chair, completely absorbed in the performance. He'd heard professional pianists at Carnegie Hall who hadn't moved him as deeply as this teenager was moving him now. But it was Malcolm's reaction that drew the most attention from those guests who knew him well. The man who prided himself on control, who had built his fortune on the ability to remain emotionally detached from any situation, stood with tears streaming down his face, his hands trembling at his sides. The nocturne reached its climactic passage, where Chopin's melody soars above complex harmonies before settling into a resolution that feels both inevitable and surprising. Lila's hands guided the music through these emotional peaks and valleys with an understanding that went beyond technical proficiency. She was telling a story, sharing a piece of her heart with people who had spent the evening treating her as invisible. As the final notes faded into silence, the ballroom remained frozen for several heartbeats. 300 powerful people sat motionless, processing what they had just experienced. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough for Lila to begin questioning whether she had made a terrible mistake. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then building to something thunderous and sustained. People rose to their feet without conscious decision, their hands coming together in recognition of something they couldn't quite name, but knew they had witnessed. This wasn't the polite appreciation they offered to professional entertainers at charity events. This was genuine emotion, the kind of response that came from being truly moved, but Malcolm didn't applaud. As the ovation built around him, he stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes fixed on Lila with an expression that seemed to contain years of regret compressed into a single moment. The sheet music for this very piece sat in Emma's piano bench at home, her handwritten notes still marking the passages where she'd struggled to perfect the phrasing. He'd found it after her death, along with dozens of other compositions she'd been working on. Dreams made tangible in black ink on cream-colored paper. Without warning, Malcolm turned and walked quickly from the ballroom, pushing through his confused guests toward the doors that led to his private quarters. The applause faltered as people noticed their host's abrupt departure, conversations resuming in hushed, bewildered tones. "What's wrong with him?" Someone whispered. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Did you see his face?" "I've never seen Malcolm Price cry." Lila remained at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, uncertain whether she should return to her serving duties or simply disappear. The applause had ended, but people continued to stare at her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. She'd succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, but her triumph felt hollow in the face of Malcolm's obvious distress. Maria Gonzalez appeared at her side, her expression kind but concerned. "That was beautiful, dear," she said quietly. "But I think you should probably get back to work now. The guests are starting to ask questions. Did I do something wrong?" Lila asked, her voice small. Mr. Price looked so upset. "You didn't do anything wrong," Maria assured her, though her own confusion was evident. That's not how Mr. Price usually reacts to music." Lila nodded and rose from the bench, but before returning to her tray, she gently closed the piano lid. The Steinway returned to silence, but something had changed in the ballroom's atmosphere. The invisible barriers between server and served had been momentarily dissolved by the power of music, leaving everyone slightly off balance. Meanwhile, Malcolm had retreated to his study, closing the door behind him and leaning against it as if to keep the world at bay. His hands shook as he poured himself a scotch, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal glass. He'd built his life on maintaining control, on never allowing emotions to override rational decision-making. But hearing Emma's music played by another young woman, someone he'd tried to humiliate, had shattered his carefully constructed composure. Maria found him there 20 minutes later, sitting in his leather chair with his head in his hands. She'd seen him through business crises, personal scandals, even the divorce proceedings, but she'd never seen him look quite this broken. "Sir," she ventured quietly, "your guests are wondering if you're all right. Should I tell them you're not feeling well?" Malcolm looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "That girl," he said hoarsely. "The waitress. What do you know about her?" "Not much. Her name is Leela Chen. She works part-time at the restaurant downtown. Why?" "She played Emma's piece," Malcolm whispered, more to himself than to Maria. "She played it exactly the way Emma used to play it." Maria's expression softened with understanding. She'd known Emma, had watched the relationship between father and daughter deteriorate over the years as Malcolm's work consumed more of his attention and patience. She'd also been there during the aftermath of Emma's death, witnessing Malcolm's refusal to grieve properly or acknowledge his role in their estrangement. "Maybe," she said carefully, "this is Emma's way of telling you something." Malcolm laughed bitterly. "I don't believe in messages from beyond, Maria. I believe in cold, hard facts. And the fact is that I just humiliated a talented young woman in front of 300 people because I was too arrogant to see past her uniform." For the first time since his daughter's death, Malcolm Price was beginning to see himself clearly, and he didn't like what he was discovering. Sleep eluded Malcolm that night, chased away by memories that had been carefully buried for months. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows from the estate's security lights played across the room. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the haunting melody of Chopin's Nocturne, played not by his daughter's familiar touch, but by the hands of a young woman he'd tried to humiliate. At 3 a.m, he gave up the pretense of rest and wandered through his empty house in silk pajamas and a robe. The mansion felt cavernous in the darkness, every room echoing with the absence of the family that had once given it life. Sandra's belongings were long gone, removed by professional movers who had efficiently erased 15 years of marriage. But Emma's presence lingered in ways Malcolm had tried to ignore. He found himself standing outside what had once been her childhood bedroom, now converted into a sterile guest room that no one ever used. Her posters had been taken down, her furniture removed, but he could still remember how it had looked, cluttered with sheet music, books, and the dreams of a young woman who believed art could change the world. The memories came flooding back despite his efforts to suppress them. Emma, at 8, begging for piano lessons after hearing a classical concert on television. Malcolm agreeing reluctantly, seeing music as another extracurricular activity that would look good on college applications. Emma at 12, spending hours at the piano when other children were watching television or playing video games. Malcolm irritated by the noise when he was trying to work from home. "Can't you practice when I'm at the office?" he'd ask, and Emma would nod solemnly. Scheduling her passion around his convenience, the relationship had grown more strained as Emma entered her teens and began talking seriously about music as a career rather than a hobby. Malcolm had been patient at first, explaining the realities of the music industry, the importance of having a practical backup plan. But as Emma's dedication to her art deepened, so did his frustration with what he saw as naive idealism. Their worst fight had come during Emma's senior year of college. When she announced her intention to pursue a master's degree in piano performance rather than the business degree Malcolm had assumed she would choose. The conversation had taken place in his study. Emma standing defiantly before his desk while he outlined all the reasons why her plan was foolish. "Music is a wonderful hobby, Emma, but it's not a career," he'd said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had conquered the business world through hard-headed pragmatism. "How many people actually make a living as classical pianists? A dozen? 20? You're throwing away everything I've given you for a fantasy." "It's not a fantasy, Dad. It's my life. It's what I'm meant to do. Being meant to do something doesn't pay the bills or build a future. I've worked my entire life to give you opportunities, to ensure you'd never have to struggle the way I did. And you want to throw that away to play piano?" Emma's eyes had filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "You don't understand. This isn't about money or security. It's about meaning, about using the gifts I've been given to create something beautiful in the world. Beautiful." Malcolm had laughed harshly. "You know what's beautiful? Financial independence, security, the ability to take care of yourself and your family. Music is entertainment, Emma. It's not a foundation for a life." The argument had escalated from there, both of them saying things they'd later regret, or in Malcolm's case, things he'd never had the chance to take back. Emma had left that night and maintained minimal contact for the next year. When she died in the car accident 6 months ago, they hadn't spoken in 8 weeks now. Standing in the hallway outside her former room, Malcolm was forced to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. Emma had been right about the importance of meaning, of using one's gifts to create beauty. The young waitress, who had played his daughter's favorite piece with such passion and skill, had proven that art transcended social boundaries, that talent and dedication were more valuable than bank accounts and business connections. Unable to bear the weight of his memories, Malcolm made his way to the basement storage room, where Emma's belongings had been packed away after her death. Sandra had wanted to donate everything immediately, unable to cope with the constant reminders of their loss. But Malcolm had insisted on keeping Emma's possessions, though he'd never examined them closely. The boxes sat in neat rows, labeled in Maria's careful handwriting: Emma's books, Emma's clothes, Emma's music. Malcolm opened the music box with trembling hands, revealing stacks of sheet music, piano method books, and composition notebooks filled with Emma's handwriting. Her musical library represented 20 years of study and passion, Bach inventions from her childhood, Chopin nocturnes from her teenage years, complex Liszt pieces from her college studies. At the bottom of the box, he found a leather-bound journal he'd never seen before. The first entry was dated 5 years earlier. "Dad came to my recital tonight, but I could tell he was thinking about work the whole time. He checked his phone during my Chopin piece, the one I've been working on for months. Sometimes I wonder if he'll ever understand that music isn't just noise to me. It's how I connect with something larger than myself, how I make sense of the world. I wish I could make him feel what I feel when I play." Malcolm's hands shook as he read entry after entry describing Emma's growing frustration with his dismissal of her passion, her desperate desire for his approval and understanding, her gradual acceptance that they would never truly connect over the thing that mattered most to her. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before her death. "Had another fight with Dad today about graduate school. He thinks I'm being impractical, naive. Maybe he's right. Maybe there isn't room in the world for people who care more about beauty than profit. But I can't live his life. I can't pretend that money and success will fill the emptiness I feel when I'm not creating music. I have to try, even if it means disappointing him. I just hope someday he'll understand that I'm not rejecting everything he taught me. I'm just choosing a different definition of success." Malcolm closed the journal, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed at her funeral. Emma had died believing he thought her dreams were worthless, that her passion was foolish, that she was a disappointment to him. The truth was more complex. He'd been afraid for her, afraid she'd struggle financially, afraid she'd be hurt by a world that didn't value art the way it valued commerce. But his fear had been expressed as criticism, his love disguised as disapproval. The next morning, Malcolm called the downtown restaurant where Lila worked, asking to speak with the manager. The conversation was awkward. Wealthy philanthropists didn't typically call to inquire about part-time servers, but Malcolm persisted, until he learned more about the young woman who had shattered his composure. Lila's a good kid, the manager, Tom Rivera, told him. Quiet, reliable, never complains about the work. She's been with us about 6 months. Picked up shifts whenever she can get them. Takes care of her grandmother, I think. Why do you ask? She played piano at my event last night. She's very talented. Yeah, I've heard her humming sometimes while she works. Classical stuff, mostly. She mentioned once that she plays piano, but you know how it is. Lot of kids think they can play. "This is different," Malcolm said quietly. "She has genuine ability. Does she go to school?" "High school senior, I think. Studies hard, always has books with her during breaks. Smart kid, but you can tell money's tight. She never orders food here, brings her own lunch in a brown bag." After hanging up, Malcolm sat in his study, staring at the framed photo of himself, shaking hands with the president. All his achievements, all his wealth, all the recognition and power he'd accumulated over decades of ruthless ambition, none of it could undo the damage he'd done to his relationship with Emma. But perhaps it wasn't too late to honor her memory by supporting another young person's musical dreams. The decision crystallized slowly, fighting against years of ingrained prejudices and his natural inclination to protect himself from emotional vulnerability. But Lila's performance had cracked something open in his carefully armored heart, and Emma's words from the journal echoed in his mind. Music was how she connected with something larger than herself, how she made sense of the world. Malcolm picked up his phone to call Maria. It was time to find out exactly what it would take to help a talented young woman pursue her dreams. The kind of dreams he'd once dismissed as impractical fantasies. The kind of dreams that had died with his daughter in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday morning 6 months ago. Malcolm spent the next 3 days attempting to return to his normal routine, but concentration eluded him like smoke through his fingers. Board meetings became exercises in distraction as he found himself thinking about musical phrases instead of quarterly projections. Conference calls with international investors were interrupted by memories of small hands moving across piano keys with impossible grace. Even his morning runs through the estate's manicured grounds felt different, as if the landscape itself had been altered by what he'd witnessed. His assistant Maria noticed the change immediately. Malcolm's usual sharp focus had been replaced by something approaching restlessness, and he'd taken to staring out his office window for long periods without explanation. When she brought him reports to review, she often found them untouched on his desk hours later. His attention somewhere else entirely. "Sir, the Morrison Industries meeting has been moved to Thursday," she mentioned during their afternoon briefing. "And your ex-wife's attorney called about the property settlement." "Maria," Malcolm interrupted, "what do you know about music education? Conservatories, specifically." She paused, caught off guard by the unexpected question. "Not much, I'm afraid." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the process. How does someone without family connections or significant resources gain admission to a quality music program?" Maria studied her employer's face, noting the genuine interest in his expression. She'd worked for him long enough to recognize when his questions were merely polite small talk and when they reflected deeper concern. This clearly fell into the latter category. "I imagine it would be quite difficult," she said carefully. "Those programs are expensive, and from what I understand, they're highly competitive. Without proper training and preparation—" "Yes," Malcolm murmured. "That's what I was afraid of." On Thursday afternoon, instead of attending the Morrison Industries meeting, Malcolm found himself driving toward downtown Richmond. He hadn't planned the trip consciously. He'd simply gotten in his car and followed an impulse he couldn't quite explain. The contrast between his estate's pristine grounds and the city's working-class neighborhoods struck him more forcefully than usual. Here people lived in small apartments above storefronts, worked multiple jobs to pay rent, made difficult choices between necessities that he took for granted. The restaurant where Lila worked occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house, its exterior painted cheerful yellow to mask the building's age and wear. Malcolm had driven past places like this thousands of times without really seeing them, but now he noticed details: the carefully tended flower boxes in the windows, the hand-lettered sign advertising daily specials, the genuine warmth emanating from within. He parked across the street and sat in his Mercedes for several minutes, questioning his own motivations. What was he hoping to accomplish? What possible purpose could be served by seeking out a teenage waitress who had inadvertently reopened wounds he'd spent months trying to heal? But Emma's words from her journal echoed in his mind. I wish I could make him feel what I feel when I play. Perhaps understanding Lila's relationship with music might help him understand what he'd failed to grasp about his own daughter's passion. The restaurant was quiet during the late afternoon lull between lunch and dinner service. Only a few customers occupied the mismatched tables and chairs that gave the place its cozy, unpretentious atmosphere. Malcolm's presence in his expensive suit drew curious glances from the other patrons, but he'd grown accustomed to standing out in ordinary environments. Lila emerged from the kitchen carrying a bus tub, her movements efficient despite the obvious fatigue in her posture. She froze when she saw him, the recognition immediate and followed quickly by what appeared to be apprehension. "Mr. Price," she said uncertainly, setting down the tub. Is everything all right? Did I do something wrong the other night?" "No," Malcolm said quickly, realizing that his presence here must seem threatening to her. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Quite the opposite, actually. I was hoping we could talk." Lila glanced around the restaurant nervously. Her supervisor was in the back office, but she wasn't sure how he'd react to her having a lengthy conversation with a customer during work hours. "I'm supposed to be working," she said hesitantly. "But I could take a quick break, I guess." Malcolm followed her to a corner booth where they could speak privately. Up close, he noticed details he'd missed at the gala: the careful way she'd mended a small tear in her uniform shirt, the exhaustion that hadn't quite hidden her natural curiosity, the calluses on her fingertips that spoke of hours spent practicing on less-than-ideal instruments. "I owe you an apology," he began, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Malcolm Price didn't apologize often, and never to people he considered beneath his social station. "My behavior the other night was inexcusable. I challenged you publicly, tried to humiliate you, and you responded with grace and extraordinary talent." Lila shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You don't need to apologize, sir. I understand that people like you don't usually expect people like me to know about classical music." "People like me?" Malcolm asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "Rich people. Successful people. People who own pianos like that Steinway." She spoke without bitterness, stating what she viewed as simple facts about how the world worked. "You played that piece beautifully," Malcolm said quietly. "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat. Where did you learn it?" A small smile crossed Lila's face, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her. "I found the sheet music at a used bookstore about 2 years ago. It was in a box of old music books that someone had donated. Most of it was simple stuff, church hymns, basic exercises, but this piece was buried at the bottom." She reached into the worn backpack beside her and pulled out a music theory textbook that had clearly seen better days. The cover was held on with tape, and the pages were soft with age and frequent handling. Tucked between its pages were photocopied sheets of music, some so faded they were barely legible. "This is my music library," she said with a self-deprecating laugh. "I know it's not much compared to what you're probably used to, but I've learned everything I know from books like this one." Malcolm examined the textbook, noting the careful annotations in Lila's handwriting, the way she'd worked through complex theoretical concepts with nothing but determination and natural ability. He thought of Emma's expensive music education, private lessons, master classes, summers at prestigious music camps, and felt a stab of shame at how casually he'd dismissed those advantages. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. "Since I was 7. My parents bought me a little keyboard from a pawn shop for my birthday. It only had 2 octaves, but it was the most wonderful thing I'd ever seen." Her eyes grew distant with the memory. "After they died, I thought I'd have to give up music entirely. My grandmother needed me to work, to help with bills and her medical expenses. But the high school let me practice on their old upright during lunch hours, and I found ways to keep learning." "You've had no formal training?" "No teachers." Lila shook her head. "Couldn't afford it. But YouTube has some amazing tutorials, and the library has music theory books. It's not the same as having a real teacher, but I've made do." Malcolm found himself studying this young woman with growing amazement. Everything that had been handed to Emma, and that Emma had ultimately chosen to pursue despite his opposition, Lila had fought to achieve with no support system, no financial resources, no encouragement from family or society. Yet here she sat, discussing complex musical concepts with the casual fluency of someone who had internalized knowledge through pure dedication. "What are your plans after high school?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Community college, probably. Study business or something practical. "Music school is expensive, and even if I could get in somewhere," she shrugged, not bothering to finish the sentence. The reality of her situation spoke for itself. "But you want to study music?" For the first time, Lila's careful composure cracked slightly. "More than anything in the world," she whispered. "I dream about it sometimes. Being able to study with real teachers, having access to a good piano every day, learning from other musicians who understand what it feels like when a piece of music just clicks, you know?" Malcolm knew exactly what she meant. Emma had described that same feeling countless times, the moment when technical skill and emotional understanding merged into something transcendent. He'd always assumed she was being overly dramatic, but sitting across from Lila, seeing the genuine longing in her eyes, he finally understood that music wasn't just entertainment for these young women. It was a form of communication with something greater than themselves. "Lila," he said carefully, "what if I told you there might be other options? What if money wasn't a consideration?" She looked at him with confusion mixed with wariness. "I don't understand, sir." Malcolm wasn't sure he understood either. But for the first time since Emma's death, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins or business acquisitions. Perhaps redemption wasn't about changing the past. Perhaps it was about ensuring the future held different possibilities for another young person whose dreams deserved support rather than dismissal. That evening, Malcolm sat in his study with his laptop open, researching music conservatories with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. The numbers were staggering. Annual tuition at prestigious institutions like Juilliard or the New England Conservatory exceeded $60,000 before factoring in living expenses, private lessons, and performance opportunities. For someone in Lila's financial situation, these costs represented an insurmountable barrier. A wall between talent and opportunity that only extreme privilege could scale. He created spreadsheets documenting admission requirements, application deadlines, scholarship opportunities, and preparatory programs. The research revealed a world he'd never bothered to understand when Emma had tried to explain it to him. Music education wasn't just about learning to play an instrument. It involved music theory, composition, performance practice, music history, and countless hours of individual practice guided by master teachers who commanded substantial fees. Emma had tried to share this information with him during their arguments about her career choice. She'd shown him brochures, explained the competitive nature of admissions, described the dedication required to succeed at the highest levels. He dismissed it all as elaborate justification for an impractical dream, unwilling to acknowledge that her path required the same level of commitment and intellectual rigor as any business venture. Now, armed with actual data about the music education industry, Malcolm began to comprehend the magnitude of what Emma had been asking him to support. She hadn't been requesting funding for a casual hobby. She'd been asking him to invest in a legitimate professional education that could have led to a meaningful career as a performer, teacher, or musician. The weight of this realization drove him from his study into the Virginia countryside, following winding roads until he reached Riverside Cemetery, where Emma lay buried beneath a simple granite headstone. He'd attended her funeral, of course, standing stoically beside Sandra while hundreds of mourners shared memories of their vibrant, talented daughter. But he hadn't returned since that grey February morning, unable to face the finality of her absence. The cemetery was peaceful in the evening light. Well-maintained grounds dotted with mature oak trees that provided shade for the neat rows of markers. Emma's grave was in a newer section, surrounded by other young people whose lives had been cut short by accidents, illness, and cruel twists of fate. The headstone bore her name, dates, and a simple inscription Sandra had chosen, "Beloved daughter, whose music lives on in our hearts." Malcolm knelt beside the grave, his expensive trousers soaking up moisture from the grass. He'd brought Emma's diary, the leather-bound journal he'd discovered in her storage box, hoping that reading her words in this place might help him understand what he'd lost, what he'd failed to give her during her lifetime. "I should have listened to you," he whispered to the headstone, opening the journal to entries he hadn't been able to finish reading at home. Emma's handwriting filled page after page with observations about music, reflections on her studies, and increasingly painful accounts of her relationship with her father. One entry, dated 3 years earlier, described a recital where she'd performed Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a technically demanding piece she'd worked on for months. "Dad came to the recital tonight, but I could see him checking his watch during my performance. Afterward, he said I played very nicely and asked if we could leave early because he had calls to return. Mrs. Harrison, my piano teacher, spent 10 minutes telling him how exceptional my interpretation was, how much potential I have, how I should consider auditioning for summer programs." Dad nodded politely, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. On the drive home, he talked about a business merger he's working on. I wanted to tell him how nervous I'd been, how proud I was of mastering such a difficult piece, how Mrs. Harrison thinks I could get into a top conservatory if I keep working this hard. But he was already somewhere else mentally. I felt like I'd performed for an empty auditorium. Malcolm's chest tightened as he read entry after entry chronicling Emma's growing sense of isolation from him. She wrote about practicing late at night so as not to disturb his business calls, about cancelling performances because they conflicted with family dinners where he discussed work exclusively, about gradually realizing that the thing she loved most in the world was invisible to the person whose approval she craved most. Another entry, from 2 years ago, revealed the depth of her hurt. "Had lunch with Mom today, and she mentioned that Dad thinks my music major is a phase I'll grow out of." A phase. 4 years of intensive study, countless hours of practice, the development of skills that took me years to acquire, all dismissed as something adolescent that I'll abandon when I become practical like him. I don't think he understands that music isn't something I do, it's who I am. When I play, I feel connected to something larger than myself, something transcendent and meaningful. But to him, it's just noise that interferes with more important things. The most devastating entries came from Emma's final semester, when their relationship had deteriorated completely over her graduate school plans. Dad called my music professors enablers today, said they were filling my head with unrealistic expectations about career prospects. He's probably right that most musicians struggle financially, but he doesn't understand that not everything valuable can be measured in dollars. When I play Chopin or Bach or Debussy, I'm not thinking about salary potential. I'm thinking about beauty, about expressing emotions that words can't capture, about connecting with composers who lived centuries ago but understood something essential about human experience. Dad measures success by stock portfolios and real estate portfolios. I measure it by moments of transcendence, by the feeling that I've communicated something true and beautiful through music. We're speaking completely different languages, and I'm starting to think we always have been. The final entry, written just days before her death, broke Malcolm's heart completely. I've accepted that Dad will never understand or support my musical ambitions. I've stopped trying to explain why this matters to me, stopped hoping he'll attend my performances with anything other than polite obligation. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am being naive about the realities of a music career. But I have to try, even if it means disappointing him, even if it means accepting that he sees me as a failure. I'd rather fail at something I love than succeed at something that leaves me feeling empty. I just wish once, just once, he could hear what I hear when I play. I wish he could feel what I feel. But he's built his life around avoiding feelings, and music is nothing but feeling. We're like two people trying to communicate across an ocean. The distance is too great. Malcolm closed the journal, his vision blurred by tears he'd held back for months. Emma had died believing he thought she was a failure, that her passion was worthless, that her dreams were foolish, adolescent fantasies. The truth was more complex. He'd been afraid for her, worried about her financial security in an uncertain industry, desperate to protect her from the struggles he'd endured building his own career. But his fear had been expressed as criticism, his love disguised as practical advice that had wounded her more deeply than outright rejection might have. Emma had needed his support and encouragement, and instead he'd offered doubt and dismissal, wrapped in the language of parental concern. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her grave, the words carried away by the evening breeze. "I'm so sorry I never understood. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself from seeing how wrong I was about what really matters." As darkness settled over the cemetery, Malcolm made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He couldn't bring Emma back, couldn't undo the damage he'd done to their relationship through years of misplaced priorities. But he could honor her memory by supporting another young musician whose talent and passion deserved nurturing rather than dismissal. Lila Chen would never have to choose between her dreams and financial survival. If she had even half of Emma's talent, and from what he'd witnessed, she might have more, then she deserved every opportunity Malcolm's wealth could provide. Not as charity, but as recognition that some things were more valuable than money, that beauty and meaning had worth that couldn't be calculated in spreadsheets. Rising from Emma's grave, with stiff knees and a heavy heart, Malcolm began planning how to offer Lila the support he'd failed to give his own daughter. It wouldn't bring Emma back, wouldn't heal the wounds in their relationship, but it might represent the first meaningful action he'd taken in months. Perhaps redemption wasn't about changing the past. Perhaps it was about ensuring that the mistakes he'd made with Emma wouldn't be repeated with another talented young woman who deserved better than the world's indifference to her gifts. Malcolm spent the weekend crafting his approach, recognizing that Lila would likely be suspicious of any offer that seemed too generous or came without strings attached. Young people in her position learned early to be wary of wealthy strangers bearing gifts, understanding instinctively that such generosity often came with hidden costs or expectations that could prove more burdensome than poverty itself. He arranged to meet her at a small coffee shop near her high school, choosing neutral territory where she might feel more comfortable than in his imposing office or estate. The cafe was busy with the after-school crowd, teenagers working on homework, young mothers with strollers, elderly couples sharing newspapers over endless refills of coffee. Malcolm felt conspicuously out of place in his tailored suit, but the anonymity of the crowd provided the privacy he needed for a conversation that would change both their lives. Lila arrived precisely on time, her school backpack slung over one shoulder and wariness written clearly across her face. She'd obviously thought carefully about this meeting, probably wondering what Malcolm Price could possibly want from her and whether accepting his invitation had been a mistake. "Thank you for coming," Malcolm said as she slid into the booth across from him. "Can I buy you something? Coffee? Food?" "Just water, please," Lila replied quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She was still wearing her school clothes, a simple blouse and khakis that met the dress code requirements, but couldn't hide her natural grace or the intelligence that sparkled in her dark eyes. Malcolm had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but facing Lila across the small table, he found his prepared words inadequate. How did one offer to transform someone's life without sounding condescending or creating obligations that would taint the gift? "I want to apologize again for my behavior at the gala," he began. "I was cruel and dismissive, and you responded with dignity and extraordinary talent. You reminded me of things I'd forgotten about the power of music, about what it means to pursue something beautiful for its own sake." Lila shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Price, you really don't need to keep apologizing. I understood why you were upset. I shouldn't have been near your piano in the first place. No, Malcolm said firmly. That piano was made to be played, and you played it better than anyone has in months. Which brings me to why I asked you here. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, his movements careful and deliberate. I've been researching music education programs, and I'd like to make you an offer. He opened the folder to reveal application materials for several prestigious conservatories, scholarship forms, and a letter he'd drafted explaining his willingness to cover all expenses associated with Lila's musical education: tuition, living costs, private lessons, travel expenses for auditions and performances. This is a full scholarship to whatever music program you choose, Malcolm continued, watching Lila's face carefully for her reaction. No strings attached, no expectations beyond your commitment to developing your extraordinary talent. Lila stared at the documents without touching them, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for me?" Malcolm had expected this question and still struggled to answer it honestly. "Because I had a daughter who loved music the way you do, and I failed to support her dreams the way I should have. Because talent like yours deserves nurturing, not neglect. Because some things matter more than money, and it took me too long to understand that. This is too much," Lila whispered, finally touching one of the application forms with trembling fingers. "I can't accept something like this from a stranger. What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" "You won't fail," Malcolm said with conviction. "I've heard you play, Lila. You have something that can't be taught, a natural musicality, an emotional connection to the music that transcends technical skill. With proper training, you could perform professionally, teach at the university level, or pursue any musical career that interests you." Lila's eyes filled with tears as she absorbed the magnitude of what he was offering. This represented everything she'd dreamed of, but never dared hope for: the chance to study with master teachers, to develop her abilities without the constant worry about money, to pursue music as more than a hobby stolen between work shifts and family responsibilities. "My grandmother," she said suddenly. "I take care of my grandmother. I can't just leave her. We'll arrange for her care," Malcolm interrupted. "Whatever she needs. Medical expenses, a caregiver, better living arrangements, that's all part of the package." For several minutes, Lila sat silently, tears streaming down her face as she contemplated a future that had seemed impossible just moments before. Malcolm watched her internal struggle, recognizing the pride that made accepting charity difficult, even when it represented salvation. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "This is the most incredible thing anyone has ever offered me. She stopped mid-sentence, her face suddenly pale. "Lila, are you all right?" She pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "I'm sorry, I just need a moment. Sometimes I get these episodes when I'm emotional or stressed," but instead of improving, her condition worsened. Lila's lips took on a bluish tinge, and her hand trembled as she reached for her purse. Malcolm watched in growing alarm as she fumbled through its contents with increasing desperation. "What do you need?" "How can I help?" "My pills," she gasped. "Emergency medication." "Heart condition?" Malcolm's blood ran cold as he helped her search through her purse. Among the usual teenage detritus, lip balm, earbuds, a few crumpled dollar bills, he found a small pill bottle and what appeared to be medical bracelet she hadn't been wearing. The bracelet was plastic, the kind hospitals used for patients, and the medical information printed on it made his worst fears concrete. Lila Chen, DOB 04-15-2007, dilated cardiomyopathy, DNR on file. Lila swallowed 2 pills with shaking hands, then leaned back in the booth, eyes closed, waiting for her heart rhythm to stabilize. Malcolm stared at the medical bracelet, his mind racing through the implications of what he was reading. "Lila," he said gently, "how long have you had this condition?" She opened her eyes, and he saw in them the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a terrible burden alone. "About a year, maybe longer, but that's when it got bad enough for doctors to notice." What have they told you about treatment options? Surgery? Transplant? Lila's smile was heartbreakingly resigned. I'm on the transplant list, but the waiting time is usually years, and my insurance situation is complicated. The doctors are honest about the prognosis. With my particular type of cardiomyopathy, most patients live 18 to 24 months after diagnosis. The words hit Malcolm like a physical blow. This talented, beautiful young woman, who had just been offered the chance to fulfill her dreams, was dying. The parallel to Emma's situation was cruel and immediate. Both young women passionate about music, both cut short by circumstances beyond their control, both leaving him helpless to protect them from fate's randomness. How long ago were you diagnosed? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. 14 months ago, Lila replied quietly. So if the doctors are right, I have maybe 6 to 10 months left. That's why your offer is so beautiful and so impossible at the same time. I can't commit to years of education when I don't have years. Malcolm felt the coffee shop spinning around him as he processed this information. The universe's capacity for cruelty seemed limitless, to place extraordinary talent in someone whose time was running out. To offer him a chance at redemption that would be cut short by the same kind of random tragedy that had taken Emma. But, Lila continued, her voice gaining strength as her medication took effect, that doesn't mean I can't make the most of whatever time I have left. If you're serious about this offer, maybe we could modify it. Maybe instead of a full conservatory program, I could study privately with master teachers, learn as much as possible, perform when I'm able to. She reached across the table and touched Malcolm's hand, her fingers thin but warm. I'm not afraid of dying, Mr. Price. I've had time to accept that. But I am afraid of dying without ever knowing how good I could have become, without ever sharing my music with people who might understand what it means to me. Malcolm looked into her eyes and saw something that humbled him completely. Courage, determination, and a fierce commitment to wringing meaning from whatever time remained to her. This 17-year-old girl, facing a death sentence with more grace than he'd shown facing his divorce, was offering to teach him something about what really mattered. Then we'll make every moment count, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We'll find you the best teachers, arrange private concerts, record your performances, whatever you want to accomplish. We'll make it happen. Lila's smile was radiant, transforming her face despite her obvious physical frailty. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving, even if it's only temporary. As they left the coffee shop together, Malcolm realized that he'd thought he was offering to save Lila's future. Instead, she was about to save what remained of his soul. Malcolm threw himself into researching Lila's condition with the same relentless determination that had built his business empire. He consulted with cardiologists at Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Stanford, arranging video conferences with specialists who normally had waiting lists measured in months. The medical picture that emerged was sobering, but not entirely hopeless. Lila's dilated cardiomyopathy was indeed serious, but with proper treatment and monitoring, some patients lived significantly longer than the standard prognosis suggested. He arranged for Lila to see Dr. Sarah Chen at Virginia Commonwealth University Medical Center, one of the nation's leading experts in pediatric cardiology. Dr. Chen reviewed Lila's case files with the thoroughness that Malcolm's influence and checkbook could command, exploring every possible treatment option from experimental medications to the latest advances in heart transplant procedures. Her condition is serious, Dr. Chen explained during a conference in her office. Lila and Malcolm seated across from her impressive desk. But she's young, otherwise healthy and responding well to her current medications. With aggressive monitoring and treatment, we might extend her timeline considerably. What does that mean exactly? Malcolm asked, his business mind demanding concrete numbers and projections. It's impossible to predict precisely, but instead of months, we might be talking about years. And medical advances are happening rapidly in this field. Artificial heart technology, gene therapy, improved transplant procedures. There are reasons for hope. Lila squeezed Malcolm's hand gently, bringing his attention back to her face. She'd grown thinner over the weeks since their coffee shop meeting, but her eyes remained bright with determination. "The doctors can help me live longer," she said quietly, "but I don't want to spend whatever time I have sitting in hospital rooms. I want to spend it making music." This became their shared mission. Malcolm hired Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned piano pedagogue who had trained concert performers at major conservatories, to work with Lila 3 times a week. Dr. Vasquez initially agreed to the arrangement as a favor to a wealthy donor. But after her first lesson with Lila, she called Malcolm with genuine excitement. "This young woman has extraordinary potential," she told him. "Her technical foundation needs work. Self-taught pianists often develop inefficient habits, but her musical instincts are remarkable. She understands phrasing and expression intuitively. With intensive work, she could be performance-ready for major repertoire within months rather than years." Malcolm arranged for Lila to have access to his Steinway whenever she wanted, essentially giving her a key to his estate and permission to treat his home as her practice space. Most afternoons after school, she would arrive with her backpack full of sheet music, settling at the piano bench with the reverence of someone who still couldn't quite believe her good fortune. He found himself scheduling his work around her practice sessions, discovering excuses to remain in the house when she was there. Her presence filled the empty spaces that had echoed with loneliness since Emma's death and Sandra's departure. But more than that, listening to Lila work through challenging pieces reminded him of what he'd lost when he'd dismissed Emma's passion as impractical dreaming. Their relationship evolved slowly from patron and beneficiary to something approaching family. Malcolm would bring her tea during breaks, and she would explain what she was working on, the technical challenges of a particular passage, the emotional content she was trying to express, the historical context of pieces written by composers who had faced their own struggles and triumphs. "Chopin wrote this nocturne when he was about my age," she mentioned one afternoon, her fingers moving through the familiar melody that had first brought them together. He was dealing with his own health problems, tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. But listen to this passage. She played a particularly beautiful section where the melody soared above complex harmonies. There's sadness in it, but also hope. He was saying something about beauty existing, even in the face of mortality. Malcolm found himself sharing memories of Emma that he'd kept locked away for months. "My daughter used to play that same piece. She said Chopin understood something about turning pain into beauty, about finding meaning in temporary things." "She sounds like she was very wise," Lila said gently. "I would have liked to meet her. She would have loved you," Malcolm replied. And for the first time since Emma's death, the statement didn't bring him crushing grief, but a bittersweet warmth. As Lila's musical skills developed under Dr. Vasquez's expert guidance, Malcolm began planning something that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, a concert to showcase her talent. Not a small recital for friends and family, but a significant performance that would attract attention from the music community and create a lasting record of her artistry. The idea crystallized one evening while going through Emma's belongings, searching for something specific he'd remembered seeing. In a box of programs from Emma's various performances, he found what he was looking for, the program from her final recital. A senior capstone performance she'd given at her conservatory just weeks before their final argument. The program was elegantly designed, Emma's photo on the cover, showing her seated at a piano with the serious expression of a young artist ready to share something important with the world. Inside were program notes she'd written herself, explaining her repertoire choices and what each piece meant to her musical development. Malcolm read her words with the attention he'd never given them when Emma was alive. Tonight's program represents a musical journey through different periods and styles. But more importantly, it represents my attempt to communicate emotions and ideas that words cannot express. Music has been my language since childhood, my way of understanding the world and my place in it. I hope that by sharing these pieces with you, I can offer a glimpse into the beauty and meaning that I find in this art form." At the bottom of the program, in small print, was an acknowledgement that broke his heart. "Special thanks to my piano teachers who nurtured my love of music, to my mother who attended every recital, and to my father, who I hope will someday understand why this matters to me." Emma had been reaching out to him even then, hoping their shared biology might overcome their vastly different worldviews. She died still hoping he would eventually understand what drove her passion, still believing that music could bridge the gap between their different definitions of success and meaning. Malcolm called the director of the local symphony hall, a venue where he'd attended fundraising galas but never musical performances. The conversation was awkward initially. Symphony directors weren't accustomed to wealthy businessmen requesting concert venues for unknown teenage pianists. But Malcolm's reputation and obvious seriousness eventually secured cooperation. "I want to arrange a recital for a young pianist who has extraordinary talent," he explained to director James Morrison. "This isn't a vanity project or a social event. This is about giving a genuinely gifted artist the platform she deserves. We don't typically rent our main hall for student recitals," Morrison replied carefully. "But if you're willing to cover the full costs and she's genuinely talented, we might be able to work something out. Could we arrange an audition?" Malcolm arranged for Morrison to hear Lila play privately at his estate. The symphony director arrived with the skeptical air of someone who had heard countless wealthy patrons overestimate their protégé's abilities. But his expression changed completely as Lila performed Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece Emma had played at her final recital. "My God," Morrison breathed as the last notes faded away. "Where has she been studying? Who's been working with her?" "She's essentially self-taught until recently," Malcolm explained, watching Morrison's amazement grow. "But she's been working with Dr. Elena Vasquez for the past month." "Elena's working with her?" "She hasn't taken new students in years." Morrison's respect for Lila's abilities was evident in his changed tone. "Young lady, you have extraordinary talent. I'd be honored to have you perform in our hall." They scheduled the recital for 6 weeks away, giving Lila time to prepare a full program while her health remained stable. Malcolm threw himself into the planning with an intensity that surprised even Maria, who had watched him organize major business deals and political fundraisers. This concert represented something different, not a transaction or networking opportunity, but a gift to someone who had given him more than she could possibly understand. "The programs need to be perfect," he told Maria, reviewing proof copies for the 3rd time. "The lighting, the sound system, the promotional materials, everything has to reflect the quality of her artistry. Sir, you do realize this is costing more than some people's weddings?" Maria observed gently. "Some things are worth more than their cost," Malcolm replied, words that would have been foreign to him just months earlier. As the concert date approached, Malcolm found himself experiencing anxiety unlike anything he'd felt since Emma's death. This performance would be Lila's debut, her introduction to the classical music community, her chance to share her gift with an audience that could appreciate her artistry. But it might also be her only major performance, her single opportunity to leave a lasting impression on the world. The weight of that responsibility, to give Lila the moment of recognition that Emma had never received from him, drove Malcolm to obsess over every detail. This concert had to be perfect, not because his reputation depended on it, but because Lila's legacy might depend on it, and perhaps, in some small way, it might help heal the wounds left by his failure to properly celebrate Emma's talents while she was alive, to know how much they meant to him. The evening of Lila's concert, Malcolm stood in his study, adjusting his tie for the 4th time, his hands trembling with an anxiety he hadn't experienced since his first business presentation decades earlier. Tonight felt different from any event he'd ever hosted, more personal, more meaningful, more fragile. The stakes weren't measured in dollars or deals, but in something far more precious, the chance to give a dying young woman her moment of recognition. Through his window, he could see guests arriving at the symphony hall, distinguished figures from the classical music community. Critics from major newspapers, professors from conservatories up and down the East Coast. He'd used every connection, every favor owed, every ounce of his considerable influence to ensure that Lila would perform for an audience worthy of her talent. On his wrist, he wore his father's gold pocket watch, a simple timepiece that had been passed down through 3 generations of Price men. His father, a factory worker who had died young from industrial accident, had worn this watch to work every day for 20 years, saving every penny to ensure his son could have opportunities he'd never known. Malcolm had carried it through every major moment of his business career, but tonight it felt heavier, weighted with the importance of time itself and the responsibility to use whatever remained wisely. At the concert hall, Lila sat in a small green room, her hands resting quietly in her lap as Dr. Vasquez made final adjustments to her performance dress, a simple but elegant black gown that Malcolm had insisted on purchasing despite her protests. Her usual pallor was more pronounced than usual, stress and anticipation taking their toll on her weakened heart. But her eyes held the calm focus of an artist, ready to share something important with the world. "Remember what we've worked on," Dr. Vasquez said gently, checking Lila's pulse with practiced concern. "Trust your musical instincts. You have something special to say through this music, and tonight is your chance to say it." Malcolm appeared in the doorway, his own nervousness barely contained behind his businesslike composure. How are you feeling? Do you need anything? Water? More time to warm up?" Lila smiled at his obvious anxiety. Over the weeks of preparation, she'd watched this powerful man transform from someone who viewed her as beneath notice to someone who worried about her comfort, her health, her happiness. The evolution had been gradual but profound, as if helping her pursue her dreams had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. "I'm ready," she said simply. "Thank you for making this possible. Whatever happens tonight, you've already given me more than I ever dreamed of." "You've given me more," Malcolm replied quietly. And she knew he was thinking of Emma, of the relationship with his daughter, that music was helping him understand retrospectively. The symphony hall buzzed with anticipation as the audience settled into their seats. Word had spread through the classical music community about this mysterious young pianist who had inspired Malcolm Price to organize an unprecedented showcase. Critics who attended out of professional obligation found themselves genuinely curious about what they might hear. Dr. Morrison provided a brief introduction, explaining that they were about to witness the debut of an extraordinary young talent. His words were carefully chosen to build anticipation without creating impossible expectations. But his genuine enthusiasm was evident to those who knew him well. Then Lila walked onto the stage. The audience fell silent as she moved to the Steinway with quiet dignity, her small frame almost dwarfed by the magnificent instrument. She sat on the bench, adjusted her position slightly, and placed her hands over the keys in a moment of preparation that seemed to stretch endlessly. Malcolm held his breath, his father's watch pressing against his wrist like a heartbeat. As Lila began to play, the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated through the hall, the same piece that had changed everything at his gala months earlier. But hearing it now, in this acoustically perfect space, played by fingers that had been refined through months of intensive training, the music revealed layers of beauty that even Malcolm's previous exposure hadn't prepared him for. Lila's interpretation had matured since that first night. The technical precision was now seamless, her fingers moving across the keys with the confidence of someone who had internalized every aspect of the piece. But more importantly, the emotional content had deepened. Where once there had been raw talent and natural musicality, now there was artistic wisdom, an understanding of how to shape each phrase to maximum emotional impact. The audience was transfixed. Critics who had arrived prepared to write polite reviews about a charity case found themselves leaning forward in their seats, drawn into the spell that Lila was weaving. Conservatory professors who had heard thousands of student performances recognized immediately that they were witnessing something exceptional, not potential, but fully realized artistry. Malcolm watched from his seat in the front row, tears streaming down his face as he experienced what Emma had tried so many times to share with him. This was what his daughter had been reaching for in her own musical journey, this moment of perfect communication between artist and audience, this transcendence of ordinary experience through the power of organized sound, the nocturne built to its emotional climax. Lila's hands guiding the melody through complex harmonies with an assurance that belied her youth and relative inexperience. She wasn't just playing the notes, she was telling a story, sharing her heart, creating something beautiful in defiance of a world that had given her every reason to despair. As the final notes faded into the hall's perfect acoustics, the silence that followed was profound, pregnant with the recognition that something extraordinary had just occurred. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before the applause began. Tentative at first, then building to something thunderous and sustained. 300 of the most discerning members of the classical music community rose to their feet as one, their hands coming together in recognition of artistry that transcended age, training, or circumstance. This wasn't polite appreciation for a talented amateur. This was genuine awe at the emergence of a true artist. Malcolm stood with the rest of the audience, tears streaming down his face without shame or self-consciousness. He'd attended dozens of performances over the years, operas, symphonies, recitals, but he'd never experienced anything like this moment of perfect communion between performer and audience. Layla had taken her pain, her limited time, her awareness of mortality, and transformed it all into something achingly beautiful. The ovation continued for several minutes, wave after wave of appreciation washing over Lila as she stood beside the piano, her small frame somehow commanding the vast stage. Her face glowed with a mixture of exhaustion and joy, the kind of fulfillment that came from sharing one's deepest truth with people who truly understood its value. When the applause finally subsided enough for speech, Lila moved to the microphone that had been set up beside the piano. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hall's excellent acoustics. "Thank you," she began, her words catching slightly with emotion. "6 months ago, I was invisible to most people, just another teenager in a uniform, trying to earn enough money to pay bills. Tonight you've listened to my music, really listened, and that gift is more precious than I can express." She paused, her gaze finding Malcolm in the front row. "But I need to acknowledge someone who made this evening possible. Malcolm Price changed my life, but more importantly, he allowed me to change his. Mr. Price, would you please stand?" Malcolm felt a moment of panic as hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Public displays of emotion had always made him uncomfortable, but something in Lila's encouraging smile gave him courage. As he rose slowly, his hand brushed against his jacket pocket, feeling the edge of something he'd forgotten he was carrying. The audience applauded appreciatively as Malcolm stood, but Lila wasn't finished. 3 months ago, Mr. Price challenged me to play his piano, expecting me to fail. Instead, we both discovered that talent doesn't respect social boundaries, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we least expect to teach us. Malcolm's fingers found the small card in his pocket, something he'd discovered while going through Emma's things the night before. He'd placed it there this morning without conscious intention, but now its presence felt significant, like a message across time. "Through supporting my dreams," Lila continued, "Mr. Price has honored the memory of his daughter Emma, who was herself a gifted musician. He's shown me that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into actions that help others achieve what our loved ones would have celebrated." As the audience absorbed this revelation, Malcolm pulled the small handmade card from his pocket. He'd found it tucked inside one of Emma's piano books, a thank you note she'd written after he'd attended one of her high school recitals and actually listened. really listened to her performance. The card was decorated with musical notes she'd drawn in colored pencil, and inside, in her careful teenage handwriting, were words that had taken on new meaning. "Thank you for being there tonight. Dad, thank you for really hearing my music instead of just being polite. It means everything when you truly listen. I love you." Emma Malcolm looked up at Lila, still standing at the microphone, and realized she was offering him something Emma had always wanted, the chance to publicly acknowledge that music mattered, that artistic dreams deserved support and celebration. Without fully planning his actions, Malcolm walked onto the stage. The audience fell silent as he approached the microphone. This powerful businessman, whose vulnerability was more compelling than any corporate presentation could have been. "I want to share something," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. He held up Emma's card so the audience could see it. "My daughter wrote this to me 4 years ago after I attended one of her recitals. At the time, I thought I was just being a supportive parent, showing up and applauding politely." He paused, looking down at Emma's careful handwriting. But Emma knew the difference between someone who was physically present and someone who was truly listening. "She thanked me for hearing her music, not just sitting through it. That card and the young woman standing beside me have taught me that the greatest gift we can give another person is our complete attention, our willingness to be moved by their attempt to share beauty with the world." Malcolm turned to Lila, his voice breaking slightly. "You didn't just perform music tonight. You reminded us all that art isn't entertainment, it's communication, connection, the sharing of our deepest truths with people brave enough to receive them." The audience erupted in another standing ovation, but this time it was for both of them. The young artist who had found her voice and the older man who had finally learned to truly listen. 6 months later, Malcolm sat in the second tier of Carnegie Hall, his hands folded in his lap as he watched Lila take the stage for what many critics were already calling the debut performance of the year. The famous venue buzzed with anticipation as music lovers from around the world gathered to hear the young pianist who had become something of a sensation following her Richmond debut. The months since that first concert had passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Lila's health had stabilized remarkably under the care of the specialists Malcolm had arranged. Her strict medication regimen and regular monitoring, buying them precious time that no one had dared hope for initially. The experimental treatments were promising, and her name had moved higher on the transplant list thanks to Malcolm's influence and resources. But more importantly, their relationship had deepened into something neither had expected, a genuine bond that filled the emptiness in both their lives. Malcolm had become the father figure Lila had never known, while she had become the daughter who helped him understand what he'd lost with Emma and what he could still give to the world. From his seat, Malcolm could see the bronze plaque that had been installed in the hall's lobby just that morning, a permanent recognition of the Emma Price Music Foundation, established 6 months earlier to provide scholarships and support for promising young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation had already awarded grants to 12 students, each selected not just for talent, but for the kind of passion and determination that Lila embodied. The plaque bore a simple inscription: "In memory of Emma Price, 1998-2024, who believed that music could transform lives, and in honor of all young artists who dare to dream beyond their circumstances." Malcolm had insisted that Emma's photo be included on the plaque, not the formal headshot from her college publicity materials, but a candid image of her at the piano, lost in music, her face reflecting the joy she found in creating beauty. It was how he wanted her remembered, how he finally understood she should have been celebrated while she was alive. As the lights dimmed and Lila appeared on stage, Malcolm felt the familiar flutter of pride mixed with anxiety that had become his constant companion at her performances. She moved with confidence now, her posture reflecting months of work with master teachers, and the quiet assurance that came from knowing her abilities were genuine and recognized. The program included pieces that had become signature works for her, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, of course, but also Bach's Italian Concerto, Debussy's Clair de Lune, and a stunning interpretation of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 that had left audiences speechless. During her previous performances, as she began the Chopin, the key piece that had started their entire journey together, Malcolm reflected on how completely his life had changed. The arrogant man who had challenged a waitress to humiliate her was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true wealth lay in relationships, in meaning, in the ability to help others achieve their dreams. His business practices had evolved too. The Malcolm Price Foundation now focused not just on writing checks, but on identifying young people with potential and providing comprehensive support. Mentorship, education, emotional encouragement, the kind of holistic assistance that transformed lives rather than merely providing temporary relief. Maria, who had watched his transformation with amazement and approval, often commented that he'd become the man his daughter had always believed he could be. His relationships with everyone, from housekeeping staff to restaurant servers, reflected a new understanding that dignity and worth weren't determined by job titles or bank accounts. The evening at Carnegie Hall was particularly meaningful because it represented Lila's full emergence as a professional artist. Record companies had expressed interest in her debut album. Conservatories competed to offer her teaching positions when she was ready, and concert halls around the world were beginning to book her for future performances. But perhaps most importantly, she had become a symbol of hope for young people facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Her story, the waitress who became a concert pianist, the dying teenager who chose to fill her remaining time with beauty, inspired others to pursue their own dreams despite circumstances that seemed to make those dreams impossible. As Lila's performance reached its climax, Malcolm found himself thinking not of what had been lost, but of what had been gained. Emma was still gone. That grief would always be part of him, but her memory had been transformed from a source of pain into motivation for positive action. Through helping Lila and the other young musicians supported by the foundation, he was honoring his daughter's belief that art could change lives. The standing ovation that greeted Lila's final notes lasted nearly 10 minutes, the kind of spontaneous appreciation that couldn't be purchased or manufactured. Malcolm rose with the rest of the audience, his eyes wet with tears of pride and gratitude. Pride in Lila's extraordinary achievement, and gratitude for the second chance she had given him to get parenthood right. After the concert, they met in the green room where Lila was still glowing from her triumph. Despite her physical fragility, she radiated a contentment that came from knowing she had shared her gifts fully, holding nothing back. "Emma would have been proud of you," she told Malcolm, embracing him with the easy affection that had developed between them over months of shared purpose. "She would have been proud of you too," Malcolm replied. And for the first time since his daughter's death, he felt her presence as a blessing rather than a burden, a reminder that love transcends mortality and that the most meaningful legacy anyone can leave is the encouragement of others to pursue beauty, truth, and connection in whatever time they're given. As they walked out of Carnegie Hall together into the New York evening, Malcolm understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not the erasure of past mistakes, but their transformation into wisdom that could benefit others. One moment of musical beauty had changed both their lives, proving that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simple act of truly listening to another human being's attempt to share their heart with the world.